nerds, what's up? You may or may not have heard, but HBO is planning to make a new Harry Potter series where there is a book per season and they think it's going to take about 10 years. This comes off the heels of Warner Brothers also announcing that they're going to make some new Lord of the Rings movies. Now, admittedly, we don't know a lot about these projects yet, but it does have the fan community sort of going, why though? Why aren't they making something new as we point to a million things we love that no one seems to be interested in making adaptations of? So today I want to talk about that, and I want to try to remove the emotion from it and really get to the heart of why these companies are doing this. Now, to be clear, my answer is no. No, stop. You shouldn't be doing this. But that's not the real answer. So today we are going to explore what makes successful adaptations, but more in particularly what makes successful remakes. We're going to talk about the money of it all, of course. We're going to talk about quality and why it's difficult to make new things, and overall try to answer the why behind these seemingly baffling decisions. See you after the jump. The first thing I want to discuss is remakes in general. My first reaction when I heard the news is that it's too soon. The Return of the King film was released only 20 years ago, while Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 was released only 12 years ago, and that's just not very long. And again, as an aside, we know very little about the Lord of the Rings movies, so they may not be remakes of Jackson's films, but until I hear we have the rights to the Silmarillion, I'm not holding my breath. Back to the point. 2 decades or under is simply not a lot, especially when we factor in how well received both the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings adaptations were. They were wildly successful both in fans' views and monetarily, to the point where these films have absolutely never left our consciousness. I can understand when remakes are there to kind of introduce it to a new generation or make them better or more in the times, but as far as I can tell, the new generation is still watching these films. They're still very much present and a part of us. This isn't really giving an old franchise new life. They already have life. A counterexample to this that I think kind of proves that point is nobody bats an eye when Christopher Paolini talks about wishing he could have a new adaptation. That one came out in 2006, so wasn't even that long ago, but it was a disaster, both to non-fans and fans alike. It got totally panned, and so when Paolini talks about wanting a new one, we're all kind of like, yeah, that tracks, that makes sense. But that sort of failure just doesn't apply to Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. I also want to note that since writing the script and planning to film this movie, I saw that they're planning on remaking Twilight as a TV show. Now, I am not super plugged into the Twilight fandom, so I feel like it's harder for me to make commentary on that. But from my outsider perspective, I thought that the Twilight films were wildly successful. So this also surprises me. If you are a Twilight fan or in the Twilight fandom, please weigh in on that below. I'm very curious to hear what kind of the fandom's thought are on that. I kind of wanted to figure out some rules for successful remakes, and as I was thinking of successful remakes, I thought of Ocean's 11, which was a wildly successful remake of a movie, and admittedly that one happened 41 years later, so I do think we had a lot of time distance. It also benefited from a huge leap in technology where the film could be made in a completely new way. If we want to stick to SFF, I could also point to Star Trek, where there was actually only a 17-year difference between the original Star Trek run series and Next Gen, but admittedly they were using all new characters in a same setting, so they weren't like directly remaking it beat for beat. Now, an important distinction in Ocean's 11 and Star Trek is that they are not remakes of an adaptation of a book. And because of that, I do think they have less limitations because the source material is just the movie or show itself and is not like both that adaptation and the original source material before it, which I do think adds an extra difficult element because there's really only one way to get it better in a remake, which is to go closer to the source material, which is the kind of only way to make fans happy, but adds this extra element of like having the source material that you need to be as accurate to as you can, but also having these extremely successful adaptations that have also introduced new things that the fans are attached to, and how do you deal with that in the remake? Does that make sense? So if we look at some really famous remakes of book to film adaptations, you get a lot of classics. You get a lot of really old books. One of the easiest ones to point to being Jane Austen, in which Pride and Prejudice alone has 28 adaptations. 28! And that's just of Pride and Prejudice. And we can point to other famous things that have probably been remade that many times, like Shakespeare, or other classic works like Frankenstein, The Christmas Carol, Sherlock Holmes, Les Mis, Dracula. The list could go on and on. And so at some point, I'm looking at SFF fans and it's maybe it's us. Maybe we're the problem. However, before we go that far, you'll notice probably a similarity to all of those works that have been adapted so many times, and that's that the newest one of those that I listed came out in 1897. These are all pretty old properties. None of the original fans of the works are alive. Not to be extremely gruesome. But look, when something goes into the classics territory, I think we can all agree something kind of shifts in the public consciousness about it. I think we are more able and willing to see a bunch of different versions of it, particularly as they get wildly different or only very loosely based on the classic work they came from. At this point, we all recognize that this will not be the first nor last adaptation of those works, and so I think there's less of a fear that somehow it going wrong is going to doom the property forever. We have something else to fall back on. And I think this cannot be said largely for Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, which came out in many people's lifetimes still living today, and so we're kind of closer to that original work and adaptation than we are about other things. Based on my research, if I had to hazard a guess on some of the rules of a good remake, I came up with 5. The first being, it's been 100 plus years since the original work was published. Number 2, the original adaptation has left the public consciousness. Number 3, the original adaptation was very poorly received. 4, it's been enough time that a new stab at it in a different format might work, or technology has significantly changed and would be relevant to the property if used. And 5, a significant new take is happening, but I find this to be extremely risky. As far as I can tell, none of these 5 things are true for either Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. And as I just previously discussed, there are some additional hurdles for Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. With Harry Potter, I specifically think of casting, where despite how any individual fans felt about those adaptations, almost everyone thinks the majority of the casting was perfect, to the point where people kind of view the casting as like sacred as the book itself, especially when I think of Alan Rickman for just one example, although there are many. And with some recent deaths, I think it has put it more like in the heart of the fans. When parts of the adaptation have become synonymous with the books, like for Lord of the Rings, you may use an example of how Jackson depicted the Eye of Sauron. That is just an additional hurdle these remakes will have to overcome because there's been so little time between them. Okay, it's time. We obviously have to talk about money. Here's the thing. Known properties make money. And we can sit here and talk all day about the art of it and how good art makes things last, and how when you just try to make a quick buck, it might not be as lasting and you'll make less money in the short run, and everyone in the important seats doesn't care. Okay, I'm obviously being a little glib about it, but when I think of what our current market rewards, it usually rewards growth above all else. So even if a company is making fantastic money, if they are not growing or exceeding quarter to quarter, they often get punished. And that's an issue when we talk about something like this, because short-term gains are most likely to be rewarded in this system rather than long-term success that makes money over time. This forcing of companies to always grow, to always exceed, isn't necessarily going to relate to the things that have the most staying power. Sometimes, but not always. Big, short-term gains are much more likely to be achieved from large, well-known properties guaranteed to make a buck. And of course, I can't blame them. TV shows and movies are extremely expensive to make, and so being risk-averse does make a little bit of sense. I can't just put it all that it's all on a bad thing. Now, there's been some good examples recently in TV shows. Unfortunately, they don't provide as good of data because for whatever reason, we just don't know as much information on TV shows as we do on movies. viewership per episode, money made in the beginning versus the end. They just don't release it, which I find extremely frustrating. But we could look to Amazon's Rings of Power. According to everything I've read, Amazon considers Rings of Power a giant success. They said it made them a ton of money. Now, I don't know if the ratio is good enough for what they spent, which was astronomical, but they say they consider it a success. Yet, we've also seen that only 37% of viewers finished the Rings of Power, which is a pretty dismal number. Now, if we want to get something a little bit more far removed that's had more time to settle, let's look at the Hobbit movies. From what I can tell, the Hobbit movies are widely considered from the fan base to not be very good, to be pretty much a money grab, to be way too long, to add unnecessary things. People really aren't a fan of them. But the Hobbit movies made a ton of money, and I'm sure were very profitable for the company that made them. So they're probably considered a success even if the fans don't necessarily agree. Just look at the relative press between Obi-Wan and Andor, which one was definitely a much more well-known and believed to be going to be successful because of its kind of star power, versus Andor. I don't have the exact data, but you know how I felt about those two shows. And the difference in how they were advertised and pushed out as being received is very different. Companies only have so much advertising money, and they're probably going to spend it on the known quantity every time as a safe bet. The companies that have the most capital probably care the least for art, and the people who care most for art probably have the least capital. Okay, that was a gross oversimplification, but it does feel that way sometimes. However, if it were always true, then good things would probably never get made, so it's hard to say. And also, to be fair, it's really easy to point to all these super successful original content and be like, look at how successful these new and original things are. You should do that. And realize we are absolutely and completely ignoring the probably hundreds of new and original things that completely bombed. So either way, we just don't really have enough data to prove anything other than what our hearts say. And we do know our hearts are often wrong. Now, something I didn't know before starting the research for this video is that the idea of the remake may be built into Hollywood's history itself. One successful Hollywood film that was made very early on in the concept of Hollywood in 1914 was called The Squaw Man, and it actually was an adaptation of a popular stage play at the time. 4 years later, they remade The Squaw Man. 4 years later. And then after that, only 13 years later, they remade it again. And to top it off, all 3 movies were made by the exact same director, DeMille. So apparently this is nothing new. If we also go and look at the United States' top grossing movies of all time for the last few decades, this also maybe proves that Hollywood's formula is working. If we ignore sequels and remakes of movies, it's pretty difficult to find top-grossing films that are new material. We've got American Sniper, Avatar, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Saving Private Ryan. Now, you'll notice I included things that were adapted for the first time. If we take away even adaptations, then original content gets even narrower, but because we're talking about book adaptations today, I thought it was fair to include them. In fairness, I will admit, as you look at this list, it does seem that the original content or original adaptations start to get closer together the further in time we go back. So maybe there's some evidence the problem of remaking is getting worse. Either way, again, we just don't really have any data to say anything definitively, but I did think it was an interesting list. As another side note, obviously you don't have to be the top grossing film of a year to be successful or considered successful. It's just an easy data set to kind of give us a baseline. Now, we can talk all we want about money and history and what have you, but the bottom line is, if the shows are good, nobody's gonna care. If it's great, everyone will forget we ever complained. We'll all pretend we didn't. We'll be like, yes, we always knew it was gonna be a success. And let me tell you, I am begging you guys to prove me wrong. I would love to point to this video and be like, look how wrong I was. Again, as I've said before though, they do have such more of an uphill battle though of what is going to be considered good. Because the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter movies are so still in our consciousness, These new adaptations are not only going to be compared against the original source material, but also some of the things the first adaptation made famous or popularized. So it'll be very interesting that they have to walk this very narrow line. Because it's been so little time since the original works were published and since the original adaptations were out, the original adaptations are tied to the original works in a way that I just don't think many adaptations are, especially when we've talked about those classic works. If I hazard a guess, I'd say these new adaptations are much likelier to fail than they are to succeed, but again, I hope to be proved wrong. Okay, let's end here talking about some questions I have for you guys to help me kind of process my thoughts and continue the conversation. The first is part of me is thinking, well, it's just more content of things I love. Why am I complaining about this? I love Harry Potter. I love The Lord of the Rings. More content is more content, right? So are we taking it too seriously? Or is the whole thing I just said the more correct thing? You weigh in on that. The other thing I have is, well, what do we do about it, right? So we have this information, what now? We could boycott it, we could not watch it, vote with our dollars, so to speak. I don't always think that necessarily matters because with these large properties, I think enough people are going to tune in no matter what. It feels a little hopeless in this case. Everyone's going to kind of want to take a peek. But then I say that, and then there's times where we've voted with our money successfully. I think of the Fantastic Beasts film franchise. The first one did well at the box office and I think was decently well received. I don't think anyone was over the moon, but I think people were oh, this is cute. This could go somewhere. The second movie, I don't literally know a single person who liked it. It bombed. It made no money. They somehow still made a third, which most people I know didn't see. I didn't see it, which is saying something because I'm a pretty big Harry Potter fan. I didn't even go and see it, and it didn't even make back the money domestically that it spent. That feels like we voted with our money, but you'll notice it took to the second and third movie, right? We all gave it a chance. And so I do think we'll probably give these shows and movies a chance, but we can always just stop watching it if it's not good. Let's just agree to that. Let's just all agree hey, we'll give it a chance. But then if it's not good, we can all just stop watching it and see if that does anything. Long term, will anything change? This might just be a trend as all things are. You let me know if you think that's true. Either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, your hopes for these things. What, if anything, you think we can do about it? Your hopes for future adaptations that you think would be successful, you let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you like these kind of deep dives, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I am currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.